Hello everyone, it's the Motorcycle Muse here, and today I'm going to be talking about the rather confusing topic of how a motorcycle ignition system works. So I'm going to go through the ignition system of this particular single cylinder motorcycle engine. Reason being, because it has only one cylinder and one spark plug, it's as simple as they come. So what is the point of the motorcycle ignition system? Well, simply put, its role is to provide or to generate a spark at the spark plug. And that allows, the spark allows the burn to begin in the air and fuel mixture inside the cylinder of the engine. So the spark plug, for those of you who don't know, will sit in the head of the engine. So on this particular engine we have our opening for the spark plug here. So the spark plug will just basically screw in there. So it's screwed in with a little socket, and this engine it actually protrudes, the top half of the spark plug protrudes from the head of the engine. And the bottom half that generates the spark is sitting inside the cylinder head. So to generate a spark at the spark plug, we need a voltage in excess of 3000 volts. So it's somewhere between 3000 and 5000 volts are required to generate, for a spark to be generated in the spark plug. Now we have to consider that the voltage in the battery of our motorcycle is only 12 volts. So how do we get a voltage of in excess of 3000 volts to generate the spark at the spark plug? So that is what the ignition system is all about. So before we talk about how the ignition system works and how it generates the spark at the spark plug, let's go through the main components of the ignition system. So starting at the cylinder head, we have our spark plug in the cylinder head. Connected to the spark plug, we have the spark plug cap. So that's just going to sit, it's just a connection basically. You push it on to the head of the spark plug, and that basically connects the spark plug to the rest of the ignition system. So from the spark plug cap, we can follow along this lead, which is called the HT lead, and that leads into the ignition coil. So the ignition coil is just this cylindrical component here, which has two terminals at the end of it, and it connects into the HT lead. So these two terminals are used to connect the ignition coil into the wiring loom. And from the wiring loom will lead to this component here, which is called the Cdi Module. So the Cdi stands for Capacitive Discharge Ignition. So you might hear of this unit sometimes being called the black box, the Cdi Unit, the Cdi box. But that's basically it. So that's the Cdi Unit. And the Cdi Unit is plugged into the wiring loom. And from the Cdi Unit, we also have a connection to the power source in this particular case, which is through this lead here which leads into the stator, which is stored underneath the cover, which is just called the stator cover or alternator cover, on the left hand side of this motorcycle engine. Now I have taken off the bolts from this cover so I can just pull it off. It's actually held on just by magnetic force. Okay. And this is the final stage of, as we trace back through our ignition system. This is our stator, so hopefully you can see that clear enough. So we have the stator here, and we have also the pickup coil, which plays an important role as well. And these are the main elements that I'm going to talk about in this video. So let's talk about the source of the charge or the voltage to power the spark plug. So on this particular motorcycle engine, the source of the power is coming from this unit here, which is called the rotor. So the rotor, let me just turn it around so you can see a little bit better. The rotor is connected to the crankshaft, and the crankshaft is connected to the piston. So as the piston goes up and down in the cylinder of the engine, it drives the crankshaft to rotate anti-clockwise in this particular engine. So as it's rotating anti-clockwise, the rotor, which is bolted onto the end of the crankshaft, rotates with it. So this is rotating at high speed, a couple of thousand revolutions a minute. And inside the rotor is a permanent magnet, and I can demonstrate that just using this bolt. So if I just stick this bolt on the inside, you can see it just sticks to it. And it doesn't matter where I put it, it just sticks left, right, top, bottom. So the whole way around we have a permanent magnet. So there is no magnet on the outside, it just will not stick to that. It's only on the inside of the rotor. So as the rotor is turning, sitting inside the rotor here is this little unit which I referred to earlier, the stator. Okay, so the stator is the unit with all the copper wire windings. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So there is 8 windings of copper wire on the stator. But for the ignition system, only one of them is important, and it's this one here. And this winding of wire is called the Exciter Coil. So the Exciter Coil, sitting inside the rotor, it's sitting inside the magnetic field, which is generated by the magnet. So you can't see, obviously, the magnetic field, it's invisible. An invisible field which permeates the entirety of this space. And as it rotates, the magnet rotating on the rotor induces a current in the exciter coil. So I won't go into the physics of how that actually works. You just have to take it for granted that a moving magnet induces a current in the windings of wire that make up this, the windings of copper wire that make up this exciter coil. So this current, this induced current, flows out this lead here, and it flows into, it's connected into the wiring loom, and from the wiring loom it is also then connected through the wiring loom to this unit here, so the Cdi unit or the Cdi box. So the Cdi box is used for storing the current generated by the stator or the exciter coil in the stator. So the alternator, or the exciter coil on the alternator, or the stator, generates an alternating current, a constant alternating current. So that current, a constant current is no good. What we need to do is we need to build up that power that's been generated and store it. And it's stored in this little unit called the Cdi unit. And as I said earlier, the Cdi stands for Capacitive, Discharge, Ignition. So the capacitive is important. The capacitive term indicates that there is a capacitor in this little unit. And a capacitor is a very simple electrical unit that can store energy, can store large amounts of energy. So the current being generated is stored in the capacitor in this little box. It builds up, builds up, builds up, and it builds up a large current. And now we will then have eventually a large enough current to power our spark plug, to generate a spark at our spark plug. So how does the Cdi box, or the Cdi unit, know when to discharge the built up current? So it can't just keep building up current indefinitely. It builds up current over a very short period of time. Over a split second, it builds up this current. And then it must discharge that current in one pulse through the wiring loom into the ignition coil. So it knows when to discharge the current because of this little unit that I showed you earlier, which sits in the top of the stator cover, and it's called the pickup coil, or it's alternatively known as the pulse generator. So the pulse generator, I don't know if you can see it clearly or not, but it's just a little small little unit. But on the end of it, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but there is just a little piece of metal just there. And that's actually another magnet. So this little magnet on the pickup coil is acted on by this protrusion on the outside of the rotor. So as the rotor is turning in the engine, this little protrusion, this little metal protrusion on the outside of the stator passes by. So the pickup coil, the little magnet on the pickup coil, is sitting here when the cover is on, and it passes by as the rotor goes through at 360 degrees. It passes by that little pickup coil, and that generates a pulse, an electrical pulse. So why does it generate an electrical pulse? Well, again, because the little metal piece on the pickup coil is a magnet, and because this is metal, again, it induces a current. So it induces a pulse. And that induced pulse or current, again, flows through this wire, out through this wire, through the wiring loom, until it comes into this Cdi unit. And that pulse triggers the discharge of the built-up current in the Cdi box. So this charge that has been building up, and it all happens over a fraction of a second, builds up, and then the pulse comes from the pulse generator, which triggers the discharge. So all that current is discharged from the Cdi unit. It travels down the wiring loom and into this ignition coil. So the flow of, the flow of current from the stator, from the exciter coil, to the CDI box is at a voltage. It usually operates at a voltage probably less than about 20 volts. Okay, so that's as the charge is built up in the capacitor, the more charge you get, the higher the voltage. So the Cdi unit acts to amplify the voltage. So when it's discharged, the current to the ignition coil is considerably higher than the voltage coming from the stator. But the problem is that the current is not flowing at a voltage that's high enough yet. So what we need to do is we need to amplify the voltage even higher. So we need to get the voltage across the electrodes at the spark plug to a high enough level that it will create a spark. So this is the whole point of the ignition coil. The ignition coil multiplies, this unit here, multiplies the voltage. So if the voltage of the current coming into the ignition coil is X, whatever the value is, the ignition coil will multiply it by 200, or approximately 200 in most ignition coils. So how does it do that? It does that because as the current flows into the ignition coil, it goes through the primary windings. So there's a primary winding in this ignition coil that the current comes in through. And around that, there is a secondary winding of very fine wires. There's going to be many more windings in a secondary coil. So we got our primary coil and we got our secondary coil. So the current flowing through the primary coil induces a current in the secondary coil, and because there is so many more windings in the secondary coil, it actually amplifies, it has the effect of amplifying the voltage in the secondary coil and in this flowing through the secondary circuit. And the secondary coil is connected to the HT lead, which is connected then to the spark plug. So another term for the ignition coil, it's basically a transformer. That's really the term. If you want to look that up, see what how a transformer works. But that's basically what it is. The primary windings induce a current in the secondary windings, and because there's so many more windings in the secondary circuit, it amplifies the voltage by about 200. So all of a sudden, we have a voltage of at least 12,000 volts being generated in the secondary coils of our ignition coil, the secondary windings of the ignition coil. Now, all that voltage, some of it actually gets lost as it flows up the HT lead. I won't go into the physics of how that happens, but it turns out that the voltage at the spark plug is about at least 3000 volts if the spark plug and the ignition system is working properly. It's going to be in excess of 3000 volts. It's going to be between 3000 and 5000 volts. And the voltage is across the electrodes in the spark plug. So the spark plug has its inner electrode and its outer electrodes. So let me just see if you can see it here in this. Try and get it into focus. So there, you can see it there now. So in the middle, on the white tip, we have a little small metal electrode. So that's the inner electrode. And then on the outside, we have 3 outer electrodes. And the inner electrodes and the outer electrodes are about, there's an air gap between the inner electrode and the outer electrodes of about 1 millimeter. So current really does not, or the charge, or electricity cannot flow through air that easily. It can only flow, it can only jump across the air gap when the voltage is high enough. And as it jumps through the air, the current flowing from the inner electrode to the outer electrode, the earth electrode, going through the air causes the spark. And that's how we get ignition in the cylinder of our engine, and how we're able to ignite the air and fuel mixture.